Jeremy Rodell is a volunteer who leads the Humanists UK's Dialogue Network. The Dialogue Network brings people together from different humanist communities so that they can facilitate better conversations with those of religious faith from different and diverse backgrounds, and hope to find common ground. This work builds bridges, develops mutual understanding, and promotes tolerance and good relationships throughout our communities. Well, thank you for joining us, Jeremy. And I know you previously had a business career and currently working in this, as you mentioned, in a volunteer role with Humanists UK as the dialogue officer. I would be interested to know why you chose to make that transition and what is the responsibilities of the dialogue officer?
Well, it wasn't really a transition. I got involved in humanism, before I retired a long time ago, and after I had a humanist wedding, by the way, which I didn't know anything about humanism until after that point. Anyway,
okay.
And I got involved and then started the South West London Humanist Hub. So it was a gradual transition, and basically it wasn't a transition from work. It was basically, removing work just gave me more time to do other stuff. And this was one of the things I was doing. And at the time I got involved in humanism, and when we started the local group up, which was in 2007, it was at the height of the Richard Dawkins, God Delusion, new atheism movement. And though that had a lot of positive things about it, it raised the profile of a lot of things. And obviously I agree with the arguments deployed in the God Delusion, though some of them are a little bit questionable. What I didn't feel comfortable was the sort of very aggressive and anti-religiosity of the new atheists. I thought that they were, that wasn't necessarily behaving in a humanistic type of way. So that's what really started me going and started getting an interest in this area. And then a number of years later, I always had been some dialogue activities, and I was very interested in it. And then Andrew Copps, and then the chief executive of Humanists UK, or was then BHA, said, well, why don't you take on this dialogue officer role? There was somebody doing it before me who had stopped doing it. So I sort of added it to my portfolio of voluntary things that I'm doing. So that's how it arose.
That's great. Yeah, and I definitely think highlighting the more aggressive tone of the new atheist movement is often one of the criticisms and one of the reluctancies that people have with coming to humanism. So I think it's some people like that, and others see it as unnecessarily antagonistic. So I think it's definitely a positive contribution to the movement. So how do you differentiate between dialogue and debate, especially when it comes to facilitating conversations between people of different beliefs and different backgrounds?
Well, I think this is an important distinction, but it's not a difficult one, really. So when we think of debate, we tend to think of, a classical, debating society at school or the Oxford Union or something, which is you have two sides and they state their case and they're trying to win. And you're listening to the other side in order to find a chink in their armour, and you can get your killer point in, and sway the audience. In practice, of course, it's not often anyone is swayed in the audience, but anyway, that's the idea of a classical debate. Dialogue isn't like that. So dialogue doesn't have a winner or a loser. The idea of dialogue is you're there to understand the other person, to help them understand where you're coming from, and often you can disagree. Disagreement, of course, is fine. In fact, you can argue that if you don't disagree, then you're missing something in the discussion. But it's a two-way discussion, and you're not aiming to win. You're not aiming to enter a discussion with a Muslim and for them to leave the room having seen the light and become a humanist. That isn't going to happen, nor is it the other way around. So that's the idea. Dialogue, not debate. Actually, that phrase, dialogue, not debate, was something we stole from an organisation called the Faith and Belief Forum, which does a lot of work in this area. Doesn't mean to say that debate isn't important and useful. And sometimes, of course, things which are billed as debates can be conducted in a sort of a dialogic manner. And often the term debate is good for getting people in the room in the first place. But the distinction when we say dialogue, not debate, is about adversarial versus non-adversarial.
Yes, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you, and thank you for the distinction. So, would it be fair to say then that there's different objectives and a success is defined differently? Where you're seeking to change minds, here it's about seeking greater understanding for everybody involved.
Yeah, well, you of course are seeking to change minds in that you're hoping to change the person's mind in their understanding about you, about your humanism, and you hopefully leave having learned something yourself. So, but you're not aiming to change people's fundamental worldviews. I suppose that's the thing. You're not intending to do that. In fact, that is an issue because if you're coming from a background where you think your aim is to convert people for an evangelical proselytizing background, as some people in Christianity do, some Muslims do, some humanists do actually, then obviously that's a bit of a problem because a sort of unwritten big rule in this area is you don't do that. You're not there to convert anybody. It's very bad form to try and do that. So you're asking those people to sort of switch off something where they think, I'm going to save you by bringing you to Jesus. Well, sorry, that's not part of the game here. You can understand the conversation about it, but you're not expecting them to do it.
Yes, and I imagine it's very important to set those ground rules early on, that everybody enters with an understanding of what we're aiming to achieve, and I guess some shared common boundaries and areas of respect.
Yeah, and it's not difficult. Most people have that understanding anyway. It's not a difficult thing, but it can be important to state that. And I remember hearing somebody actually, I was in a series of dialogues a little while ago, which included a Reformed Jewish speaker. She was a rabbi. And she said that, one of the things that makes a lot of Jewish people very cautious about dialogue is because throughout history, most of the time other people have talked to them is in order to try and convert them to Christianity.
Yeah.
That's been the agenda. And so, you're understandably a bit cautious about it. So you've got to be careful about it. The sad thing about that, though, is it means that some people choose not to engage because they'll say, well, if I can't share my profound view that you really ought to come to Jesus, then, what's the point in getting involved? So, that's another issue.
So encouraging dialogue and people to be more open to it is very important as well. I'm wondering, are there any particular examples of particular successes that you've encountered, or a very challenging situation which turned into a success in your experience?
Well, I think when you say that, it's very obviously the difficulty in this area is measurement. You can't measure success really, because this is quite a sort of soft thing. Yeah. But I think that you can. I think actually of an example which is something that Central London Humanists did a number of years ago now, and some of your colleagues will remember, which was a series of meetings with a Muslim group, and which took place in various places. I think the first one was in a room in Conway Hall, and then another one was in the boardroom at the Central London Mosque in Regent's Park. And that was interesting because we did because you get to know people over a series of meetings and you've eaten with them. But that was one of the things that came out of that. Food is very important in building relationships. You could get under the surface of things and understand people. And I thought that was, obviously we disagreed on the fundamentals, but that was a successful thing. I think where things are difficult, I always find saying no very difficult. And we have had to say no a few times because sometimes you've got to be a little bit careful that people don't try and exploit you. You can have had a couple of cases where people have invited Humanists UK to be involved in dialogue work, where when you look at their background, it was quite clear that they were extremely hardline and were not in the business of listening to anybody at all, but would have benefited from the fact that, we're actually really very open people, and look, we've even had these humanists on one of our panels.
Right.
And you you've got to be a bit cautious about that. Sincerity is very important in this area, and if you think somebody's insincere, then that's just a red line. I think, and you also sometimes it's quite rare, but as we've implied in this conversation, there's a spectrum of views among humanists in this area. Some people, are very anti-theist, and often for very good personal reasons. That we have a spectrum, same as faith groups do. And sometimes it hasn't happened often, but we've had one or two cases where people have sought to get involved in dialogue and join a network because they wanted to, tell the religious people, where they were wrong, and and they had that motivation, which obviously is fine to have it, but dialogue isn't the place for it. So
it's not helpful, and it's not particularly productive. No.
So we had to say no to those people, but they're very, very important.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I can also bring it back to your point earlier on about, the new atheists. I mean, it is always the people who are sort of most famous for their atheism that kind of people, those who don't understand humanism, as you say, the range of views that people might hold, they'll just see those who are most outspoken or most infamous for their non-theistic views and go, well, that's potentially the atheist or the humanist view. So yes, again, another reason for more open dialogue.
Exactly. Yes. I mean, the number of, you do still encounter people who expect, you say you're a humanist, they expect you to have expect you to be Richard Dawkins in different forms.
Yes.
Equally, it's important not to emphasise this spectrum. There are a lot of people who do have that view, including Richard Dawkins. And you've got to respect that view, and that's fine. I just don't share it. Though I obviously agree with his arguments about the non-existence of a deity, but that's a different point.
Yeah, and I think in general we've seen a lot more, or I've certainly seen a lot more literature in the past few years around constructing or creating constructive conversations more broadly. Taking it out, just talking about faith. I think polarization that we've seen. People having much stronger, identity views as well. And so I think it'd be interesting to understand or get some tips from you in terms of some of the strategies that you recommend to implement to facilitate constructive conversations where there may be quite a considerable difference of opinion.
Well, I think the question is, where do you get involved in that in the first place, of course? As I said before, if you're somebody's wanting to engage with you for an ulterior motive, then be very cautious. Most people are not like that, though. And I think we're humanists, and the important thing here is engaging with people on a human level. And if you need to be cautious, and I remember doing some dialogue with a local Catholic group here near where I live, which followed a big campaign about a Catholic school, which I was very heavily involved in, and was very controversial. It was about the new school with a 100% faith-based admissions policy, which we obviously didn't like. And we agreed after the dust had settled to try and have a conversation, and it was very successful. But the first thing we did with that was to have a conversation. We actually got an outside facilitator, though I don't think we really needed it, but we did. But it started off by people just talking about their personal lives, about their family or what they did. And it was to humanise, the people in the room before we started talking about the sort of, significant issues. So I think that's the way in, is not to go sort of smack into a controversial area, but to talk about your shared humanity in some way, your personal life.
Yeah, that's such a good point. And again, that's something I've seen a lot of the literature on this recently. Build rapport, find those commonalities that humans who us all talk about relationships with families, with friends. There's going to be so many. We're going to have so many more things in common before you start talking about where we differ.
Exactly right. Yeah. Yes. I think one thing which, when we talk about this, though, comes up, and I find a very useful thing to have in the back of my mind, is this thing about values. And a couple of years ago, there was Professor Linda Woodhead did a series of talks. It was during COVID, so it was all online. And her thesis, it was done for Birmingham University, and you can just Google them, and it was called Values of the New Religion. So she's a professor of sociology of religion. Okay, she's now at King's College London, and this was her thesis, and it wasn't just that point. She was saying what was being replaced by, but essentially, what she was saying was that there is, to quite a large degree in our country, a broad set of generally shared liberal with a small l values. And that's actually often the basis in which, in an unconscious way, you're engaging with other people. Now, it doesn't mean to say everybody shares those values. And obviously, around the fringes of them, there's some big differences. But that makes it a lot easier to have those conversations. That often you're finding the people you're talking to, actually, a lot of the time, you don't have common ground only because of your shared humanity, but also because you have a high percentage of shared values. Yes. Tolerance being one of them.
Absolutely. And I guess that provides then a framework from within which you can start to construct, here's my argument, here's my point of view, this is why I value, or why I would advocate for this model as opposed to this route over here, based within the framework. Whereas I guess if you had a completely different framework of values that you're operating in, it's going to be really hard to even engage on a topic.
Yes, it is. Yes. So, I mean, if example being, so mostly the people you engage with in the dialogue area, they would all agree that freedom of religion or belief is an important thing. And obviously, as a humanist, I would very strongly advocate that. But, I have had conversations with people who just reject the whole concept of human rights. Right. I think human rights is not, because human rights is a human created thing as a concept, flowed primarily from the, post Second World War, Holocaust and all of that. And they say, well, why do you don't need that? These are man-made things, where we've got a book here which tells us all we need to know. So they reject. Now, it's quite hard to get past that.
Yes. Yeah. Is that one example where you would say that's probably a boundary where dialogue would not necessarily be productive?
Well, it was productive in the sense that I came away having a better understanding of where that person was coming from, because they seemed a very intelligent, pleasant person. But obviously we have an area of profound disagreement. Yes. And it's quite hard to get past that. Yeah. Yeah.
Is there anything that someone could come to you with and where you would think actually that this is kind of not even something that it's not even worth entertaining? Is there any kind of, I guess, set of values or a viewpoint that would be just really shut dialogue down straight away?
Well, I think, there are quite a few of those, aren't there? I mean, I think if somebody was advocating, violence or hatred, then I think, well, that's, they are your enemy. And so, yeah, I think those are definitely red lines. There are red lines, and we shouldn't be mealy mouthed about that.
Sure. Do you think there's any value in trying to, shift someone who holds those types of, very prejudiced views, at least shift them towards, away from that, towards a more liberal understanding?
I think that's very, very difficult to do. It's rather like people who believe in conspiracy theories. If you just try, confront them with counterfactuals, all that does is drive them more deeply into the hole. Yeah. I think all you can do in those cases is to engage at a human level and just say, well, can you tell me about your family or what you do for a living or where you like to go on holiday or something like that. And really just say, well, okay, perhaps you both leave having thought, well, okay, we have a profound disagreement here, but I recognize that person as a fellow human being, and they may, in that sense, not be a horrible person. They may just have views I profoundly disagree with. Yes. So that's about as far as you can go.
Yeah. And for them, you hope it's maybe the first crack in quite a hardline belief set that may eventually lead to a long-term change of mind.
Exactly, because it's much easier to sustain a hatred or a view that leads to hatred by dehumanizing the other person.
Yes.
The other view.
Yes.
And that's very hard to deny when you are confronted with a real person that you can see all your human instincts are telling you, well, this is not an unreasonable person, and and they're not trying to kill me. So I think that's why I think contact, and there's been a lot of research that is so important. That can break just talking to people. It doesn't really matter what you talk about in a way. That on its own, particularly in difficult times, like obviously we're in a period where there's a lot of tension at the moment, is really, really important, and that can go a long way just because we're human.
Absolutely, it does seem to be the bedrock of breaking down, as you say, hatreds, which dehumanizing is really the same thing. And if you can force someone to humanize their enemy, that then becomes very difficult to rationalize the hatred going forward. So it's certainly the bedrock.
Obviously,
sorry,
you can't be naive about that. If that person is an enemy and they are trying to destroy everything you value, then you have to fight that. I think we shouldn't be naive about that. But there's also the question then how you fight. And there are a lot of people doing good work in this area, even in conflict areas. Just this morning I saw a tweet from a Palestinian Jewish group in Israel Palestine who are trying to do that. You think, well, okay, those are brave people, but even in that tough situation, but of course, unfortunately, the current situation, nobody's listening to them. But
there are some very good examples I saw as well too. Fathers from either side of the conflict who've both lost children, who've connected and are starting a support group in the same way. And I agree. I mean, we need more voices like that, and like yours, of course, as well, who are building these bridges. Just before we wrap up, I wonder if there's anything that has surprised you through having these dialogue conversations, or what has surprised you the most through engaging in more interfaith dialogue?
Well, I think one of the things is once you start talking to people, you realise the huge diversity within every group. And we know about it within humanism. Actually, it's not enormous within humanism. We're quite coherent in terms of our value set, I think. We talk about the anti-theism, but when you start talking to Catholics or Muslims, you realise, gosh, there's a lot of diversity, and particularly in the case of Islam, so complicated. It's so complicated, and then that's just at the level of which groups people identify with, and then individuals within those groups. And I found that one of the dangers is thinking, as you said right at the beginning, that the loudest voices that you see online are actually representative of the average. There is no person who represents the average, particularly in Islam, because it's not organised. But even Catholicism, you think, well, the Pope represents Catholicism. No, he doesn't.
No.
So that's the thing. I think you've learned is that people, and the more, of course, we've been successful, people of a liberal view, been successful in educating people to think for themselves, the more diversity there is.
100%. And speaking of education, I know you'll be hosting a couple of training sessions for anyone interested in joining the Dialogue Network. So what can our listeners expect if they were to sign up? What could they expect to gain from the training?
Well, we do that in two stages. There's the first one, which is the ones I think you're referring to. I think the one 10th of April is one that's still got some spaces available if you go on the website. That is really just an introduction to dialogue. So it covers some of the things that we've been talking about here. It's the idea behind dialogue. It is a little bit about the sort of techniques of dialogue. Then for people who actually want to do it more seriously, get involved in it, I mean, dialogue is basically local activity because of what we said. It's about encounter, and that happens locally. We do another one, it goes into it in a bit more depth into techniques and encourages people. And we have a network of people who successfully complete those two parts, which we call the Dialogue Network. And what you found from the Dialogue Network, how that's done differs enormously in different parts of the country. But we have a network, and coincidentally, we haven't done a court, over 120 people in it now. and we have an online meeting once a quarter, and we sort of get together and talk about what's going on. So anyone's interested in this, you don't have to go that far. For a lot of people, the thinking process behind dialogue and some of the techniques are valuable in the other things they do, like people who are doing pastoral support work, school speakers, celebrants. All of these people are people who encounter people from faith backgrounds, quite often, just in the other work they're doing. And therefore, that's a useful bit of, CPD, even if you don't want to go on to actually spend more time in it as dialogue as such.
Definitely. I think we can all use training and coaching on how to have better and more constructive conversations and be more empathetic and considerate to those that we're discussing with. So thank you. And we will include the links to the upcoming sessions in the show notes. So thank you very much for everything that you do with the network, Jeremy.
Oh, thanks, James. Good to talk to you.
And just before we go, our standard closing question: what's something that you've changed your mind on recently?
Audiobooks. I was rather dismissive of audiobooks. And then somebody encouraged me and said, you should give it a go. And I sort of signed up to Audible, and it's been great. And and it means I've now heard all the books I thought I should do, but I can't get around to reading, like some of the Victorian classic, Middlemarch. I listened to whatever it was, 37 hours of Middlemarch. And you think, bloody hell, this is actually a brilliant, brilliant book. Would I have sat down to read it? No, I wouldn't. But read by a really, really good reader, it was fantastic. And I've done lots of books like that, and highly recommend audiobooks. So that was a big change for me.
Fantastic. I couldn't agree more. Yeah, I found, but I'm a huge fan of Audible as well, mainly non-fiction, and typically, science and philosophy books will be read by the author as well, which I think just adds a level of engagement when the author is reading it as well. I guess it's like a long form podcast as well, which is always nice.
It is sort of, yeah.
Fantastic. Well, Jeremy, thank you so much for everything, and we'll also include links to South West London Humanists for any of our local listeners that would like to join the local group.
Thank you. That'd be good. Yeah,
and
we're very active. Yeah,
absolutely. Actually, would you like to give us a couple of minutes on the activities with South West Humanist?
South West London. Yeah. Well, I mean, we're just a local group. We're quite active. We have a meeting. We do walks and have a book group and do other things. But we have a main meeting once a month, which is now mainly face to face, but is also available online. So it's hybrid meeting. Usually a speaker, but not always. Our last speakers were our friends from Faith to Faithless, and they did a great job on that. But we had all sorts of people. I hope we're going to hear next from somebody about humanists at risk. We have people from Samaritans. We have a religious speaker once a year. And the last one we had was a guy who I know from my local interfaith work, who was a Mormon, which is quite interesting, quite challenging. And so it's a very varied program, and easily accessible. Just Google us.
Fantastic. Jeremy Rodell, thank you for joining us on Humanism Now.
Thanks, James.